If we decide to do this thing, we can do it successfully. And there's also no doubt in my mind that the whole world hangs in the balance.
Thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedule to come here tonight. Arcadia was the code name for the first wartime conference between Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, the American and the British chiefs of staff, and it was one of the most successful of the international conferences of World War II. It occurred in Washington, D.C. between the 22nd of December, 1941, and the 14th of January, 1942. And it was key to the evolution of the Anglo-American relationship. Yet it's received scant recognition. This is not one of the conferences you've heard about. The official British history, it emphasized the superior British planning and condescendingly portrayed the Americans as naive and disorganized amateurs. It recognized that there was some organizational success, such as the creation of the combined chiefs of staff, but slammed the conference because it didn't rectify two diverse philosophical approaches to defeating Germany. The peripheral approach of Great Britain versus the direct approach of the United States. And while it's true that during this conference the Americans did make mistakes, planning was much better than conventional wisdom. And when you look beyond the Churchill and Roosevelt relationship, it does reveal impressive staff work. As the planners from both the United States and Great Britain made a good attempt to set aside national prerogatives and prejudices and offer a series of exceptional position papers. As you all know, on the morning of 7 December 1941, Japanese carrier-based aircraft attacked the U.S. Pacific Fleet at anchor at Pearl Harbor. The raid achieved complete surprise, and in less than 90 minutes, 19 U.S. warships were either sunk or damaged, to include 8 battleships. 300 military aircraft were destroyed or damaged, and more than 6,000 American service members were killed or wounded. But beyond the sheer destruction, the ability to surprise the American fleet demoralized the American public. Winston Churchill was at home entertaining 2 U.S. envoys when he heard the news on the radio. He immediately contacted President Roosevelt and asked him, "Is it true?" Roosevelt said, "Yes, it's true. They've attacked us at Pearl Harbor. We're in the same boat now." Now, Churchill, writing after the war, and this is repeated by many historians, writes about his emotion on hearing the news that the United States fleet had been attacked. And he said, "No American will think it wrong of me if I proclaim to have the United States at our side was to me our greatest joy. I could not tell the course of future events. I knew the United States was in the war, up to the neck and unto the death, and so we had won after all." And everybody repeats that. Problem is, it may have been true on the evening of 7 December, but that euphoria did not last long, because on the morning of 8 December, less than 24 hours after Pearl Harbor, the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, summoned to his office the senior British air officer in Washington, D.C., and informed him that B-24 bombers that were scheduled to be delivered to Great Britain were now being withheld. We needed those bombers to defend the west coast of the United States. Immediately following that meeting, he went to a meeting of the supply board. And at that meeting, he changed the priorities. Now top precedence would be given to equipping American armed forces. This had a severe effect on the Lend-Lease program, which had been designed to give the British American-manufactured military arms and equipment it needed to fight Germany. No longer would Lend-Lease military equipment enjoy a priority over American military requirements. Cutbacks meant that the British were going to get less military equipment. Besides these reductions, Churchill was also worried that the United States would focus all its attention on the war against Japan, something that Churchill thought was a secondary threat at best. So less than 48 hours after Pearl Harbor, Churchill gets online, he contacts Roosevelt and says, "I need to come over there and I need to bring my military advisors with me, and we need to have a meeting. And we need to discuss the whole war plan in light of new reality and new facts, as well as problems of production and distribution. Well, Roosevelt knew his chiefs were a little busy 48 hours after Pearl Harbor. So he tried to push the meeting off. And he said to Churchill, you know, that's a good idea, but why don't we do this in a couple of weeks? Why don't we just push this off? Churchill said, no, I need to come now. So Roosevelt goes, well, I'm a little worried about your security. Maybe we should wait a little bit and then you should come over. Churchill's not getting the message. No, I need to come now. So very reluctantly, Roosevelt acquiesces. He said, well, if you have to come now, you have to come now. Okay, fine. As you might guess, the American chiefs were not thrilled to hear 72 hours after Pearl Harbor that they would be hosting, they got the word 72 hours, that within 2 weeks that they would be hosting their British counterparts at a conference in Washington, D.C. It seemed in those first 72 hours, anything that could go wrong in the Pacific was going wrong. And their demands for information and for movement of equipment and personnel were just overwhelming the small pre-war planning staffs. But more than that, the Americans resented the British penchant for demanding more and more American-made equipment. The deal is the British needed the equipment now to fight Germany. But if the United States was going to grow its military, and the Army's going to grow to 8.8 million men, if you're going to grow it, to equip the new divisions, the new bomber groups, the new bomber wings, you needed the equipment produced in the United States. Give you a frame of reference, 5 out of every 6 tanks produced in the United States in 1941 went to Great Britain. In the months preceding Pearl Harbor, every military aircraft produced in the United States was going to the Lend-Lease program. The Americans weren't looking forward to haggling with the British over equipment produced in this country. In contrast to the frenetic pace in Washington, Churchill boarded a battleship, Duke of York, on the 13th of December for a 9-day trip to the United States. He brought with him his absolute best and brightest. To represent the Navy, he brought Admiral Sir Dudley Pound. Pound was the head of the Navy, first Sea Lord, been in charge of the Navy for 2 years. He had the utmost respect and admiration of Churchill. They worked very well together. To represent the Air Force, he brought the head of the Royal Air Force, Air Marshal Charles Portal. Young, vigorous, brilliant. Churchill had a tendency to meddle with the Army and to meddle with the Navy because he knew all about how to run those organizations. But he had a tendency to leave the Air Force alone. Subsequently, he had a great relationship with Portal. He had the utmost confidence in him, and they got along very well. But his choice to represent the Army was different. He brought with him Field Marshal Sir John Dill, a man he had just fired as chief of the Imperial General Staff. They had argued and butted heads all through 1941, and Churchill had it and fired him. And to add insult to injury, he is assigning him as governor of Bombay, a job with a nice title and no responsibility. And he did that so that Dill could not talk to the press and could not talk to politicians and undercut Churchill in England. But at the very last minute, the new head of the Army, General Sir Alan Brooke, goes to Churchill and says, you know, it might not be a bad idea to bring Dill with you. He seems to have a good relationship with the Americans, and you're gonna need that in this conference, so I think you should bring Dill with you. Now, to give you an aside, Brooke had worked for Dill several times. He considered Dill his mentor. And looking at it, he looked at the arguments through 1941 and he thought Dill had been right. The problem was personality more than judgment. What Churchill would say later is that when I yell and scream and pound on the table, Brooke yells and screams and pounds harder on the table. Churchill didn't necessarily like that, but he respected it. Dill wasn't that type of person. He was very quiet, very introspective. When Churchill made nasty comments about the military, Dill had a tendency to take it all very personally. They did not get along. But Churchill thought, well, Brooke might be right. I probably need somebody that can get along with the Americans. I'll bring them with me. And this proved to be very fortuitous on his part. Now, the three service chiefs, they were part of the Chiefs of Staff Committee. And this was a body that had been created in 1923, so it was in existence for almost 20 years, which provided a regular venue for meetings of the three service chiefs to discuss issues, prepare plans, and to provide advice to civilian leaders. They had planners assigned to subcommittees that reported to them. And the system enabled the British chiefs to review various relevant facts systematically and thoroughly and come up with a consensus-based decision. British staff officers and the chiefs grew up for 20 years under this system. They understood its role and they understood its position in the decision-making process. By way of contrast, the American Army and Navy acted independently of each other. It had no secretariat to organize records or prepare agendas for meetings. And actually, at this point in the war, they were hardly sharing information with each other. Churchill expected to drive the conference to achieve three objectives. First, he wanted the Americans to recommit to the Germany First strategy and to dedicate the bulk of our resources to the defeat of Germany. Second, he wanted to minimize the near-term diversion of American-made equipment, which had just happened with Lend-Lease. And third, he realized when the United States mobilized for war, it was going to mass-produce tanks, planes, guns, ships, and he wanted a greater share of that production. Previous meetings had left the British skeptical, and their official history writes, skeptical of the quality of strategic thinking by the Americans. Pretty snarky, their official history. The real reason for this was when the Americans met with the British at the ABC-1 conference in February, March 1941, and then again at Arcadia in August of 41, the Americans kept quiet. Roosevelt was dealing with an isolationist Congress, and the last thing the military wanted to do was make a commitment that got Roosevelt in trouble with Congress. So they had a tendency to make no commitments. They listened, they would interject periodically, but they didn't want to agree to anything that would bind the president's hands. Subsequently, the British thought, coming over to this conference, they were going to have to school the Americans in the appropriate strategy and resource objectives to defeat Germany and Japan. Churchill also had an unwritten objective. He had suffered adversity and defeat. He hadn't surrendered. He had the utmost of confidence in his abilities. He had boundless ambition. He thought he was the right person to lead the Anglo-American alliance. He wanted to defeat the Axis, but he also wanted to maintain the status quo and the prestige of the British Empire. And the way to do that was to guide Roosevelt into the appropriate strategic objectives and resource allocations to defeat the Axis power. But Churchill realized there was one major problem as he approached, and that was in the Far East, and that put Singapore in the crosshairs. In the immediate post-World War I era, Britain was broke. The abrogation of the Anglo-Japanese naval treaty, and Japanese expansion in the Far East created a strategic dilemma for the British. The Commonwealth nations, Australia, New Zealand, Malaya, Burma, India, they felt threatened by Japanese expansion, and they wanted a commitment from Britain that they would defend them. So the British naval strategy during the 1920s and 30s was that they were going to build a large naval base at Singapore. They couldn't afford two fleets, so they'd only have one, and and they keep that fleet in the Atlantic. But if there was ever a threat of a war, within 70 days they would move the fleet from the Atlantic to Singapore. Commonwealth nations took this as a commitment, and they took it very seriously. Problem was, this whole strategy is predicated on stability in Europe, and as Germany expanded, there is no stability. And it became obvious by 1937, Britain couldn't fulfill its commitment to the Commonwealth nations. So in 1941, twice, they tried to square this circle by having the Americans move a fleet to Singapore. They argued that Singapore is the key to the defense of the Far East and infinitely more important than the Philippines. The Americans thought that this was absurd. We already put all our money into a base at Singapore. A base at Pearl Harbor. And the Philippines is more important to us than Singapore. So the Americans said no. At the ABC conference in February, March 1941, the Americans said no, and the British didn't like the answer. So the British military put it in diplomatic channels. They went to the ambassador, who took it to the American Secretary of State, tried to do an end run around the military and forced the American military to move a fleet to Singapore. The Americans thought that this was dirty pool. This violated the terms of the agreement for the ABC-1 conference, and so they were prepared to walk out. They had the support of the Secretary of War, Secretary of Navy, and the Secretary of State. Nobody wanted anything to do with this in the United States. There was an impasse, and Churchill finally had to break it by writing a note to his senior representative and told him, "We're trying to get the Americans to help us with the war against Germany. Drop the subject of Singapore." And so it dropped, but it was a festering wound which was going to raise its ugly head during the Arcadia conference. Now, the first day of the conference started out just as bad as the British official history said. The American Army and Navy planners didn't talk to each other, so they didn't know how many people were coming to the conference. So as the American chiefs, senior leaders, milled around in the hallway with their planners and their note takers and their strap hangers, they had to find a room big enough to hold everybody. And this is a sketch. There are no pictures, so this is the only thing we have of it. A sketch of the main conference room in the Federal Reserve Building in Washington. And they finally, after some time and much embarrassment, got everybody situated in the conference room. And I've been there. It's a huge conference room. So there's plenty of room in the back for all the note takers and planners. But once they got everybody seated in the room, the conference went quite well. Admiral Stark, the senior member of the host nation, opened the conference. This is on the 24th of December, the first formal meeting between the American and British chiefs. And he said that the United States is committed to the Germany First strategy. So the British #1 objective coming to the conference is taken care of in the opening seconds of the first meeting of the Arcadia conference. One historian later called it the most important strategic decision of World War II. But it didn't end there. The next thing they did was they had a discussion. They called it grand strategy. It was sort of a broad blueprint for how they were going to go about defeating Germany. And there was very little discussion and much agreement. Basically, they're looking at it in 5 phases. First thing is, the United States needs to mass produce tanks, planes, and guns, and get raw materials to England so they can mass produce weapons. Everybody agreed to that. Little problem in the Atlantic with U-boats. So you needed to secure your lines of communication so you could get equipment from the United States to Great Britain, to Russia, to the Middle East, to Europe. Everybody agreed to that. 250 German divisions were tied down in Russia. Probably a good idea to keep 250 German divisions tied down in Russia. So we need to keep Russia in the war. So we need to get aid to Russia. Everybody agreed to that. We need to wear down the Germans. Strategic bombing campaign, blockade, aid to resistance groups. Everybody agreed to that. The final phase was return to the continent. Literally, that was a one-liner. Return to the continent. No time, no place, no date. And this is why this conference gets criticized. Because 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, on the 24th of December, there was no agreement on how we were going to land on the continent and what we were going to do. Both sides left with a different opinion of what that meant. To the British, we're going to use our air power and sea power. We're going to fight on the periphery. We're going to minimize the cost of Allied lives, and Germany will implode just like they did in 1918. To the Americans, especially to General Marshall, if you wear them down, so much the better. But eventually, you're going to have to land in France, destroy the German army, and drive into Germany. The direct approach. Two different philosophical approaches, not discussed. Never came up once during the whole conference. The Joint History Office asked Admiral Stark after the war, "Why didn't you bring this up? Why didn't you talk about it?" And Stark said, "We had so few resources 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, there was no reason even trying to come up with what was going to happen when we landed, if we landed in France. It was premature to discuss anything like that." Over the next 3 weeks, the planners from both the United States and Great Britain worked 18-hour days to take the policies and to tie that to strategy or strategic objectives and allocate resources. And they do a really good job of making a number of very flexible and adaptable position papers. But it did not take long for Singapore to rear its ugly head. That evening, Churchill and Roosevelt were at the White House alone, Christmas Eve, having cocktails. Churchill gets an emergency message. "We've got troops on a ship. They're en route to Ceylon. Can we divert them to Singapore to beef up the garrison?" Now, as Churchill's writing his message, saying, yes, okay, you can divert these resources, for some reason, to this day, nobody knows why, Franklin Roosevelt makes an off-the-cuff remark. "Well, since it's not likely we'll be able to break through the Japanese blockade of the Philippines, perhaps in the interest of Allied cooperation, we could divert resources elsewhere in the Pacific." Churchill seizes on that. He calls in his secretary, dictates a message. "Tomorrow, at the second meeting of the American and British chiefs, you will discuss the diversion of resources from the Philippines to Singapore." Churchill's pretty happy. This has been a good day for him. I mean, he's got Germany first, broad agreement on the grand strategy. Looks like Roosevelt's buying into his Singapore strategy. He's following Churchill's guidance. Churchill fires off a note to the Prime Minister of Australia, telling him, how well things are going. Fires a note back to London, telling them just how good everything is going. And he goes to bed that night pretty happy. But the next morning, the American chiefs wake up to this message saying, "Today you're going to discuss the diversion of resources from the Philippines to Singapore. In essence, you're going to abandon the Philippines and you're going to give our resources to Singapore." Marshall sees that note and he goes apoplectic. He summons to his office the head of the Air Force, Lieutenant General Henry Arnold, and his lead planner for the Far East desk, Dwight Eisenhower. And he says, "Do you know anything about this? We're abandoning the Philippines. What's going on?" And they all look at him, deer in the headlights. "We don't know anything about this either." So the three of them march over to see Secretary of War Henry Stimson, and they are irate. And they demand answers. What's going on? Now, Stimson had been at home on Christmas Eve with his wife. He was not at the White House. He knows nothing about this. It makes no political sense. I mean, every newspaper in the country is carrying front page stories of the heroic defense in the Philippines. The New York Times is likening it to the defense of the Alamo. This is political suicide to abandon the Philippines like this. Plus, you have to understand, Stimson had also been former Governor General of the Philippines, so he's got a strong affinity for the Philippines. He doesn't understand it either, but he's very professional. He takes the high road. He says, "Look, you guys go to your meeting with, go to the church services with your counterparts in Roosevelt and Churchill. You go to your meeting. This is my job. I'm the Secretary of War. I'll fix this. I'll talk to the president. I'll get this straightened out. You guys go." He thinks about this, and gets on the phone and he calls Harry Hopkins, the president's special advisor, somebody who's always in the know. He says, what's this about us abandoning the Philippines? You know, Hopkins is thinking, you know, it's a little early on Christmas Day for all this doom and gloom and rumor control. Hopkins hadn't been at the White House. He's a widower. He was with his daughter. He wasn't there either. But he doesn't believe it. He thinks Stimson just got a rumor, and this is, you know, he's a little annoyed at Stimson for bringing this up. But he goes down the hall and he says to the president, Mr. President, are we abandoning the Philippines? It's all the way you ask a question. And Marshall would say later that Roosevelt had a habit called the cigarette flick. And he would have this long cigarette holder with a cigarette in his hand, and he could be dismissive. No, Harry, I don't know what's going on. I don't know. Abandon the Philippines? No, I don't know what you're talking about. So Hopkins goes back down the hall, calls Stimson. He's a little annoyed at Stimson. And he says, I just talked to the president. We're not abandoning the Philippines, you know, basically doesn't appreciate, you know, this rumor control. That's more than Stimson can bear. So he reads word for word the message that Churchill had dictated the night before, saying that they would abandon the Philippines and send all the resources to Singapore. Now Hopkins, and then to add insult to injury, Stimson's running 3 shades of hot. He says, and you can tell the president if that's his official policy. He's got my resignation as Secretary of War. I'm not defending this to the press, to the public, or to Congress. Right? This is his policy. Hopkins goes, calm down. Let me go talk to the president. But this time a different Harry Hopkins walks down the hall. Goes down the hall, shuts the door, looks at the president, very quiet, and says, Mr. President, what did you do last night? Now the president realizes, maybe I shouldn't have said that. And he's very sheepish. And he goes, no, Harry, look, resources for the Philippines, they go to the Philippines. You know, we're not abandoning the Philippines. Of course not. Tell you what, we'll have a meeting tonight. You be there, have the Secretary of War, the Secretary of the Navy, the military chiefs. I'll talk to everybody. But no, resources intended for the Philippines, they're going to the Philippines. We're not doing that. Well, Hopkins' takeaway is whenever Churchill and Roosevelt can never be alone in the room together. Somebody's got to sit there to make sure no promise gets made that causes trouble. But he's got it back in a box, and he goes back down the hall, and he says to Stimson, I just talked to the president, we're not doing it, tells him about the meeting tonight. Stimson calms down. He thinks, okay, Hopkins has got it all under control, the president will apologize, which is what he does do that night, and everything's smoothed over. But this all takes time. You've got Stimson to Hopkins to Roosevelt, Roosevelt, Hopkins, Stimson, Hopkins, Roosevelt, and back again. And in the interim, the American and British chiefs meet for the second time on Christmas Day. And this time, it's a much frostier environment. Now, the British weren't going to abandon Singapore and give all British resources in the Far East to the United States to defend the Philippines. They had to be embarrassed by this. This is not the way you build an alliance. This is not the way you build trust. But Churchill had directed it, and gamely, Portal opens the meeting by saying, what resources do you have en route to Australia that are supposed to go to the Philippines that we can quickly divert to Singapore? And he wants lists. He's looking for lists of planes and guns and tanks that can quickly be sent to Singapore. Now, when you ask people after the war, Pogue and others go around and they interview the planners and the principals on the British and American side, everybody says that there was one dominant personality, and that was George C. Marshall. And if you want to know the moment where he first exerts himself internationally, it's in the opening minutes of the second meeting of the Arcadia Conference on Christmas Day, because he cuts off Portal. We're not talking about that. Marshall realizes the real issue is not support to the Philippines or support to Singapore. Finite resources compel a unified plan and a unified command structure to ensure the Allies use their resources efficiently and effectively. He had to resolve the divisiveness because as long as it festered, they would never agree on a strategy in the Far East. Churchill was pursuing a short-term logistic solution favorable to Britain. Marshall wanted the Allies to develop an organization capable of planning, coordinating, and working together in the long war. He found the British approach too narrow. Rather than micromanaging the air, sea, and land resources of multiple nations from afar, he recommended they have a unified command within a designated theater. A single theater commander with direct knowledge of the situation could properly allocate resources within his respective theater. The involvement of multiple levels of command would just result in Marshall refereeing endless food fights over equipment and personnel, something he was loath to do. Instead, he insisted the commander on site could make the best determination of the best way to defeat the enemy. Now, these recommendations are unprecedented, and it cuts to the heart of the issue. Commanders everywhere have localitis. Wherever I am is the most important place in the world. And because I'm in the most important place in the world, I need all the resources. Marshall's dealing with 12 agencies. You got Great Britain, you've got the United States, you've got Australia, and you've got the Dutch, all in the Far East. And each has an Army, Navy, and Air Force. So you have 12 separate agencies pinging Washington, demanding all the resources. Marshall thought that a single theater commander could rise above national demands and decide conflicting directives and create an effective operational strategy. Never before had the Army, Navy, and Air Force of multiple nations been fused under a single commander. In fact, the American Army and Navy had never been able to work under a single commander. The response to this was muted. Marshall hadn't had time to prep anybody for this, and so it really didn't go over very well. And Portal came back to, what can you quickly divert to the Philippines? Well, Marshall said, we're not talking about that. We're going to talk about single theater. And the two of them butt heads, and it's kind of an impasse. You know, Portal's not giving, Marshall's not giving. And Pound steps in, Admiral Pound steps into the breach and says, we'll study the single theater command's concept. And that ends the second meeting of the Arcadia Conference. Marshall knew, he hadn't had much time. He had only woke up this morning to find out this was the topic, so he hadn't had much time to prep the issue. And he had a problem. The American Navy did not like this. The British Chiefs of Staff did not like this. And when he heard it, Churchill hated it. But one person did like it, and that was Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt felt that lack of unity of command is what caused all the problems at Pearl Harbor. The Army was responsible for the defense of the Hawaiian Islands. The Navy was responsible for the defense of the fleet. They hadn't talked to each other, they hadn't coordinated with each other, and he got a disaster. That wasn't going to happen to Franklin Roosevelt. So over the next few days, Marshall, with a strong assist from President Roosevelt, worked on everybody. Roosevelt had a very short conversation with the Navy. They got religion. We support single theater command. Yes, sir. Through a series of exceptional position papers, Marshall outlines the responsibilities and the limitations and the benefits of the single theater commander and what his key responsibilities would be. And the British chiefs think, this just might work. So they lean that direction, but Churchill still hates it. So Roosevelt arranges for Marshall to go to the White House and talk to Churchill. Now, after the war, Portal would say in an interview with Horace Pogue that we were busy during the war and Churchill didn't feel the need to be polite when talking to people. That's code for he could be pretty nasty and could run roughshod over his military advisors. And he was used to doing that. So Marshall goes upstairs to brief on the unity of command. Churchill's in his pajamas and his bathrobe. And he goes right for Marshall's throat. What does an Army officer know about driving a ship? I'm going to digress for a second. You've got to understand Marshall. If you couldn't handle the truth, you really shouldn't ask his opinion. He gets the job as Chief of Staff of the Army because in 1938, as a Major General, he's sent to the White House. They're talking about some other topic. He's one of many people in the room. And Roosevelt decides he's going to introduce a new idea. And he says, you know, in 1939, we're going to build 10,000 airplanes. Now, at this point, the United States Air Force only has 1,400 airplanes. But in 1939, we're going to build 10,000. And everybody in that room says, oh, Mr. President, you're brilliant. Mr. President, what a great idea. We're fortunate to have a leader of your vision leading us. You know, Roosevelt's pretty happy he's there. Yes, I am pretty smart. And he's looking around the room, and he's feeling really good. And then he notices there's one guy in the room who looks like he sucked on a lemon. And that's General Marshall. So he asks his opinion. He says, General Marshall, what do you think? Marshall proceeds to tell him, what a stupid idea that is. Who's going to fly the planes, Mr. President? We don't have 10,000 pilots. We don't have a training program to get 10,000 pilots. Who's going to fix these airplanes, Mr. President? We don't have mechanics for 10,000 airplanes. We don't have a training program to get mechanics for 10,000 airplanes. You know, Mr. President, these things break down a lot. We need spare parts. Where's the provisions for the spare parts? Oh, by the way, Mr. President, where are you going to put 10,000 airplanes? We don't have any facilities for the 10,000 airplanes. And he just rattles off all these second and third order effects that nobody's thought about. And as he speaks, it's like you suck the air out of the room. You can hear a pin drop. Everybody's just dumbfounded that, you know, he'd speak to the president like this. And Roosevelt, you know, went from being pretty happy to, you know, okay, meeting over, everybody get out of here. And everybody comes up to Marshall and they say, you know, if you kept your big mouth shut, you could have been Chief of Staff of the Army. Marshall goes, okay. He goes back, and everybody thought like that except Roosevelt. Roosevelt thought, man, that guy is smart. I didn't think about any of that. You know, I think it's a good idea that we have 10,000 airplanes, but somebody needs to take my vision and turn it into reality. And we do need somebody to fly those planes. And we do need training programs. And we do need a place to put the planes. And we do need facilities for them. I need somebody like that working for me who's going to turn my vision into reality. Roosevelt comes away greatly impressed. So a few months later, he calls Marshall into his office and he says, how'd you like to be Chief of Staff of the Army? Marshall says, you know, I'd like that, but I reserve the right to always give you my honest opinion, and that might not always be pleasant. Roosevelt tried to make a joke at him and said, well, you said yes pleasantly enough. But Marshall said, yes, sir, but in the future, it may not always be that pleasant. Well, if Marshall's that brutally honest to the President of the United States, his boss, you can imagine he's not just going to roll over. When Churchill goes for his throat and says, what does an Army officer know about driving a ship? And Marshall says, I don't want him to drive the ship. I want him to command the theater. Churchill takes a step back. This is going to be a little more difficult than I thought. So he tries his favorite tactic. He's going to give a history lesson. And he brings up two British admirals from the 17th century, 1600s. And he starts building this case for Marshall. And Marshall just cuts him off. He doesn't have time for this. He just cuts him off. I don't want to hear about that. I care about what's going on in the Pacific with the Japanese today. Well, Churchill said, this is going to be a lot more difficult. And those two guys go head to head in the White House. Marshall comes downstairs later, and Roosevelt goes, how'd it go? How'd it go? Marshall says, Mr. President, I didn't convince that guy of anything. And with that, Marshall leaves the White House. But Churchill gets dressed. He comes downstairs a little while later, and he says, okay, we'll give theater command concept, we'll give it a try in the Pacific. And he agrees to it. And so the American and British chiefs, they devise the ABDA command, American, British, Dutch, Australia command in the Far East. And although it's short-lived, they learn a lot of lessons, and it becomes the model for single theater commands that's used everywhere else throughout the remainder of the war. Now, another side benefit that comes out of Marshall's plan for single theater command is who's going to allocate resources and give strategic guidance to theater commands. And they come up with the concept of the combined chiefs of staff. Now, combined is collaboration between two or more countries. So the American and the British Chiefs of Staff collaboration is on the combined Chiefs of Staff. And basically what they agreed to is that the British will leave a mission in Washington, D.C. of senior Army, Navy, and Air Force officers. They will co-locate with the American services. But on top of that mission will be Field Marshal Sir John Dill, somebody that all the Americans get along with and like. And another aside, after the war, when they interview King, Admiral King, he's got nothing good to say about anybody who wasn't in the American Navy, with one exception, and that's Dill. Everybody admired Dill. The senior British officers in the British mission would coordinate with the principal British officers, the chiefs, back in London on a daily basis, but they would be co-located with the Americans in Washington. Bottom line is the war would be run out of Washington, D.C. But if there was ever a need for a change in strategy or a major issue that needed to be discussed, they would meet, and this is the other international conferences you hear so much about, they would meet face to face and they would hash them out. And Roosevelt and Churchill would meet also. An interesting side benefit of this was the creation of the Combined Chiefs of Staff is the Americans had nothing like the Chiefs of Staff Committee. The American Army and Navy was barely talking to each other. So, inter-service collaboration was rudimentary, at best. There was no mechanism similar to the Chiefs of Staff Committee to direct the war effort, and without an organization to coordinate and direct inter-service collaboration, difficult to imagine how they would formulate and execute strategy. Marshall recommended that they create a Joint Chiefs of Staff. He said, since in Great Britain, the Air Force is an independent agency, on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Arnold would sit as an equal member. So we would match up and mirror the British system. You'd have somebody represent the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy. Now, feuding, petty jealousy, inter-service rivalry didn't evaporate overnight, if ever. But the new organization forced the military services to integrate planning, intelligence, and resource requirements, and to meet with the British by presenting a united front. When Churchill came over, 2 out of the 3 objectives had to do with logistics. So on the 26th of December, Churchill arranged for a meeting where Lord Beaverbrook, the head of supply, his Minister of Supply, met with Roosevelt to talk about what Great Britain needed in terms of equipment, tanks, planes, and guns. And Beaverbrook proved to be very eloquent. He used the metaphor of a stool with 3 legs. He said 1 leg is the military equipment produced by Great Britain, 1 leg is the raw material coming from the Commonwealth nations, and the 3rd leg is American production to bridge the gap between British requirements and production. And to hammer the point home, he handed out lists. This is how many tanks you need to give us, how many guns you need to give us, how many planes you need to give us. And he gives us all that. But the most important thing Beaverbrook did was he looked at American production goals for 1942 and 43 and told the president, you're scheduled to produce as many tanks and guns in 1942 as we are. And if that's all you're going to do, we're going to lose this war. This is a much bigger country. You should be able to mass produce tanks, planes, and guns. Roosevelt took this to heart. He'd already had people working on it, but this was the impetus that 11 days later he announces the production goals for 1942 and 1943, and the numbers are astronomical. By 43, we will be outproducing all the Axis and Allied powers combined. So the bulk of Churchill's needs and requirements are taken care of in the production goals that Roosevelt announces on the 6th of January. Churchill also had, one of my last points here, he had an ulterior motive on this. He also wanted to control the distribution of military equipment. In Great Britain, the British system was the Minister of Supply allocated how many tanks we're going to build, how many guns we're going to build, how many planes we're going to build. The military was completely cut out of it. They had no say. The Minister of Supply said how many got built. Then he reported to the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister doled out these resources. So Churchill makes a recommendation to President Roosevelt. We're going to create a munitions assignments board. And it'll have two parts. One in London, under Beaverbrook, reporting to Churchill. One in the United States, under Hopkins, reporting to Roosevelt. What he really wanted was a big share of the second one. And the military's cut out of this. The Combined Chiefs of Staff have no say. We, Churchill and Roosevelt, would make the final determination on where resources were allocated. Roosevelt thought, well, interesting concept. But he makes no commitment. He sits on it for a few days, to the very last day of the Arcadia Conference, 14 January. The American and British chiefs have met for the 12th and final time. There's going to be a wrap-up session. The American and British chiefs, Churchill and Roosevelt, they're going to go over what got agreed to and what was still outstanding that had to be worked on. But right before that final meeting, Roosevelt asked Marshall to come into his office. And this time Hopkins sat in, again, like he did with Beaverbrook, to make sure no agreements got made that would cause any trouble later. And he hands Churchill's proposal to Marshall and says, well, what do you think? Marshall flips through it and says to the president, Mr. President, this is a recipe for disaster. You can't separate logistics and strategy. The Munitions Assignments Board has to report to the Combined Chiefs of Staff. And if you don't do that, well, basically he says if you don't do that, what's going to happen is if somebody changes their mind on strategy or doesn't like something, they just undercut the strategy by not allocating the appropriate amount of resources. So what you have to do is they have to report to the Combined Chiefs of Staff. And Marshall felt so strongly about it, he told the president, look, if you sign up for this, Mr. President, I'm going to have to resign as Chief of Staff of the Army. So Roosevelt doesn't miss a beat. He goes, okay, Harry, what do you think? And Hopkins says, I agree with General Marshall. I don't want to be responsible for undercutting the strategy that's been agreed on by diverting resources someplace else. So I agree. It all should be under the Combined Chiefs of Staff. Roosevelt goes, okay, then that's what we'll do. Get everybody in here for the final meeting. So everybody comes in, and they're talking about what's been accomplished, what's still to do. And Churchill's chomping at the bit. He's looking for this commitment. And he says, Munitions Assignments Board. And Roosevelt goes, oh, we're not going to do that. Churchill's like, he thought he had a commitment. And he tries to argue with the president. But Roosevelt does not argue in a public forum. He's got Marshall to do that. And Marshall tells him, well, you can't separate strategy and resource allocation. It's got to report to the Combined Chiefs of Staff, and kind of butt heads. And Churchill's not too gracious. He ends the meeting. The final meeting ends with Churchill saying, well, we'll give it a month. We'll give it a trial for 1 month. But the key takeaway that Churchill got was, one, Roosevelt's his own man. He's not going to be easily guided. And the second thing is, Roosevelt has other people he listens to. Most importantly, Marshall. And Churchill writes notes back to London saying, Roosevelt listens to Marshall. That's somebody I have to get to know. And that's his takeaway from it. Now, I've been running on for a while, so let me just wrap up by saying this. Marshall was very appreciative of the conference. He said that before Arcadia, the Americans were myopically focused on reinforcing isolated garrisons in the Pacific. Arcadia and the British forced them to look at the war holistically, to look at the total, the big picture. And he really appreciated them coming and forcing them to do that. He got a lot out of it. I spent a lot of time in the book talking about the chiefs are very collegial. The planners are not. The planning meetings are very acrimonious. Part of that staff methodologies, national prejudices, American Anglophobia, and British condensation. The British official history said the Americans were naive, disorganized, and amateurish. The Americans felt that the British were arrogant, and they were trying to compensate for a long string of defeats. Why should we listen to you? Was it your Korean operation in Norway? Was it your 3-week campaign in France? Was it Greece? Was it your operation in Crete? Was it your operation in North Africa? The chiefs were the model of collegiality. They never would have said anything like this. But in the hard fighting in the planning meetings, oh, this bubbled over. But it was good because it gets national agendas and prejudices out in the open and gives them an opportunity to build from there. Otherwise, it would have just festered. This conference was the key to establishing the Anglo-American alliance and was the genesis of the special relationship.